To help visualize the characters, to help keep them straight, I'm going to use the actors' images from the 1995 Castle Rock production of Othello, which stars Lawrence Fishburne as Othello and Kenneth Branagh as Iago. And so we have a decent number of characters here to keep track of. Othello is the title character, and we can say he's the protagonist. He's the one with whom we are to identify. But clearly he's not the most active character on the stage. The most active character, that role is going to go to Iago. He's the one we see the most, he's the one we hear the most, and he's the one who speaks directly to the audience, whereas Othello does not. Iago is a new type of character in the Renaissance, and with Shakespeare in particular. There have been, during the Middle Ages, there was always a character called the vice in any kind of morality play. A morality play would, travel around and try to put on a short production that would teach the audience some sort of moral lesson. It would have one character called the vice who would try to cheat other people and would act sinful and would try to be sort of devilish. And ultimately he would get his in the end. He would come to a downfall, whereas the character who represented the virtue would always do the right thing, and even though it would seem to put him at a disadvantage, ultimately he would be victorious and he would be rewarded in the end. Iago is very similar to this vice character, but where he changes in the Renaissance is with the recognition that that virtue doesn't always win. The good guys don't always win. Virtue is not always going to be ultimately successful. And this is maybe somewhat unfairly frequently associated with the political philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli, who was a Florentine who wrote most famously his work, The Prince, advocating, not necessarily advocating, but sort of describing the realistic way politics works. That if someone tries to, especially if a ruler tries to win everyone over, that they're actually less likely to be successful. They're more likely to be taken advantage of than someone who is very aggressive in protecting their own interests. And the character of Iago is perhaps deceptively familiar to us today. He's every Kevin Spacey character, every sociopath who outthinks and outwits the sort of more naive but more virtuous other characters. He's the Peter Baelish in Game of Thrones, and I think the Peter Baelish and Ned Stark dynamic in the first season of Game of Thrones is very similar to the Iago and Othello dynamic. But this is someone whose thinking we see at work, whose thinking is more complicated, maybe uglier, or definitely uglier, but also it's a little harder to figure out. It takes a little more attention than someone like Othello, who we know is going to do the right thing, who's very predictable, and we admire that in the character. That character is easier to understand, easier to admire, but can only really survive if external forces are there to reward him for his good behavior. The Iago type of character is someone who's very good at understanding the way other people think. So with all the discussion of theory of mind we've had so far in this class, obviously this is someone that I'm going to want to trace the way he represents to himself and in his monologues the way that other people think. So we see Iago thinking about other people's thinking. He's not the only one that shows theory of mind in the play of Othello, but he's the one that understands other people's thinking well enough not just to know the rules by which they normally behave, but how their behavior, how their decision-making process will change when their situation changes, when the context, when the environment forces them to think quickly or defensively. One of the earliest definitions I gave you for theory of mind comes from the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who said, having a theory of mind means being able to understand what another individual is thinking, to ascribe beliefs, desires, fears, hopes to someone else, and to believe they really do experience those feelings as mental states. I bring up Robin Dunbar again because he specifically uses Othello as an example of the complexity of theory of mind as it's represented in literature. This is actually his slide on the left, top left, from the presentation he gave at the Nobel Conference at Gustavus Adolphus College in 2008. And he uses the same slide from the 1995 Othello production with Lawrence Fishburne and Kenneth Branagh. but he's trying to show that to understand what's happening in Othello, we can't just depend on character types the way we would in a virtue and vice morality play, or if there were just stereotypes in the text or on the stage. We could just look at the type and say, I know how that character is going to act because this type of character always acts this way. In Othello, you can't do that. And we have to see Iago looking beyond the types, looking to see how to manipulate the types, how to change their behavior from the usual into what he wants those to be. And so Dunbar actually maps out 5 levels of intentionality, or 5 levels of theory of mind here. When he writes, and then he describes this again in his book, The Human Story, he says that in writing Othello, Shakespeare intended that his audience realize that the eponymous Moor believed that his servant Iago was being honest when he claimed to know that his beloved Desdemona loved Cassio. Shakespeare has to get us to think about how Iago is thinking about Othello, thinking about Desdemona, thinking about Cassio. That makes things confusing, to say the least. But just like anything else that is difficult, it actually exercises our skill in that department. So I'm going to reconstruct Dunbar's theory of mind map of Othello here just a little bit. It's already complicated, but the play is actually much more complicated. The reason the play Othello and the character of Iago in particular are such good examples of theory of mind is due to the utility of theory of mind in deception. If you think someone else thinks that someone else thinks something, that someone else thinks something that's actually true, it doesn't really matter how many levels of theory of mind there are, especially if you can independently validate that thing. So there's this thought at the other end of this chain of thinking, and if the thought is true, you don't actually have to keep in mind all the different links in that chain, all the different brains, we can call it a brain chain, all the different brains in that chain between you and that ultimate idea. But if any of those mental links in that chain is wrong or deliberately deceptive, then it suddenly becomes very important to be able to map out how other people's mental representations there are between you and this idea. So to understand Iagos lie, and it's not just a single statement of a lie, it's the way he manipulates everyone. To understand that, we have to not only understand how he is representing Othello, representing these other things, but we have to compare that to the way he represents other things. In other words, he knows that Desdemona loves Othello and is not cheating on him with Cassio. He knows that Cassio is loyal to Othello. He keeps those mental representations. He has a very accurate theory of mind of Desdemona, a very accurate theory of mind of Cassio. But he has to keep those distinct from the way he wants Othello to think Desdemona thinks about him and about Cassio. In fact, he is the one creating that difference. So for his deception to work, he has to know how to separate Othello's understanding from the accurate representation of Desdemona's thinking. And Robin Dunbar has pointed out that the evolutionary reason for the size of the human brain is a sort of cognitive arms race between the ability to deceive others and the ability to catch deceivers. When humans or our pre-human ancestors began to live together in larger and larger groups, we were better able to share resources, to defend each other from rival groups and that sort of thing. So it was an evolutionary advantage to have to be part of a larger group. But if you're part of a larger group, that's more people who could potentially sabotage you or cheat you or pretend to be part of the group and pretend to be loyal, pretend to help out, but actually deceive you and take your resources. Not give anything back, just promote themselves and their own offspring at the expense of you and your offspring. So as our groups got larger, our brains had to become much better at keeping track of other individuals around us, knowing what they knew, and that made us better able to deceive them, but it also made us more suspicious, better able to carefully keep watch on potential cheaters. And it's for that reason that we're, if just to lie to somebody wouldn't, just if it was just an immediate and a lie out of nowhere, probably wouldn't work very well. Simply lying wouldn't be enough if the lie didn't resemble reality in some way. Some lies work better than others, and those who understand theory of mind are better able to create a convincing lie. Iagos lies don't start with like a blunt declarative statement like Desdemona is having an affair with Cassio. Even if Othello didn't immediately suspect Iago of lying, he would still doubt the statement because it comes out of nowhere and it doesn't explain anything in Othello's experience up to that point. So what Iago has to do is gradually direct Othello's thinking in a slower, more subtle way. And what I want to do now is look at the ways that he does that in the text. So if I told you that I've got a 4-letter word here and it's missing one letter and I want you to fill in that letter, but I'm going to preface it like this. I'm going to say, before you eat, fill in the missing letter below. There are at least 2 letters you could put there to make an English word. But I think if I start out by saying, before you eat, fill in the missing letter, I think I know which of those 2 you're going to choose. This is called priming. If I make you think of dinner, if I make you think of sitting down to eat a dinner, make you think of appetizer, something becoming before the dinner. I like this picture because it has a salad, the kind of thing you would usually be served before the entree. Something else you might normally be served before the entree, something that you would eat with spoons, like the one sitting next to the salad. That would not, notice I'm not showing you a picture of soup. I'm just showing you things that are associated with soup. So when you think about what letter to fill in that word with, you're probably thinking of a U rather than an A. But if I showed you this image and I said, after you wash your hands, fill in the missing letter, even though, again, there's no image of soap in this scene, the scene is associated with soap. We would normally expect to see soap, whether a bar of soap or a soap dispenser, on one side or the other of that sink. So you're more likely to look at this image and add an A to the word. So priming is trying to activate a particular representation or an association in memory before then asking you to carry out an action or a task, or in this case just fill in a word. I'm trying to make you think of something without actually saying that thing. And I'm triggering associative coherence. Remember this term from all the way in the beginning of the semester. Associative coherence is when you think a lot of things ought to go together. Just mentioning one thing makes you think of the other. And so if I showed you all these words, thread, pen, eye, sewing, sharp, point, and then later I asked you, did I say the word needle? Most people thought they remembered the word needle. The word needle wasn't actually said, but it was activated in your mind because all of these other things connect in your mind. They cohere with the word needle. So here's another little psychological experiment. This one comes from the behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Which of these 2 events do you think seems more likely? Event number 1, there's a massive flood somewhere in North America next year in which more than 1,000 people drown. Or event number 2, there's an earthquake in California sometime next year causing a flood in which more than 1,000 people drown. Now, most people take this look at this question, and one of them just seems really intuitive. It just seems like the kind of thing that typically happens. And most people say, I think it's more likely that an earthquake in California will happen sometime next year that causes a flood in which more than 1,000 people drown. The problem with that is the earthquake is not actually that relevant. Both of these options contain a flood in which more than 1,000 people drown. But the one about the earthquake in California adds an extra criteria, or 2 extra criteria. One extra criteria is that there's an earthquake in addition to the flood, and the other criteria is that it has to happen in California. Well, California is in North America, so if the second option was true, then the first option would also be true. And the earthquake has to cause a flood, which means if the second option was true, then the first option would also be true. All that's required in the first one is that it's in North America and that there's a flood. So there's an associative coherence with the ideas of earthquakes in California. That's the kind of thing that's familiar. So we tend to assume that that option is going to be more likely. And we overlook the other part. So this coherence, this common idea, this set of ideas in our heads frames the actual logical decision. Logically, it should be obvious that because the second alternative is contained within the first alternative, that the first alternative is the most likely. But that whole thinking process is framed by this really loud and intuitive idea that earthquakes happen in California, earthquakes happen in California. It makes it really hard to specifically look at the logic of the question and say that the first answer is much more likely. So the intuitive, the coherent model frames the specific thought that we're trying to formulate. And Kahneman points out that coherence like this has a cost. He says, coherence means that you're going to adopt one interpretation in general, ambiguity tends to be suppressed. This is part of the mechanism that you have here, that ideas activate other ideas, and the more coherent they are, the more likely they are to activate each other in the mind. Notice, not the more likely they are to be true, just the more likely they are to seem true because they activate other thoughts within your mind. Other things that don't fit into that frame, into that coherent associative model, fall by the wayside. We're enforcing coherent interpretation. We see the world as much more coherent than it is. The confidence that people have in their beliefs is not a measure of the quality of the evidence, but it is a judgment of the coherence of the story that the mind has managed to construct. Quite often, you can construct very good stories out of very little evidence. People tend to have great belief and great faith in stories that are based on very little evidence. Another thought experiment that comes from Kahneman's book is this one. If you look at let's call them lines on the top box and compare them to the lines in the bottom box, the fact that I'm calling them lines probably seems kind of odd. Obviously, they're numbers in the top box and they're letters in the bottom box. But wait, look at the two lines in the middle of both of those. They're exactly the same. But what looks like a 13 when it's in the top looks like a B when it's between an A and a C. In both of these cases, these are framed. These two lines, the one straight or relatively straight line and the one sort of curved line, either the 3 or the right half of the B, they're shaped the same, but the shapes on either side of them determine what associations we have with them. So this is what we call framing. This is placing information in a specific and limited context, and that influences how we interpret the information. Limited specifically because if you think about the way a frame works with a picture, it actually doesn't add anything to the picture. What it does is cut out some elements. And this is very similar to the sorts of framing we talked about in Chaucer, where we have a narrative frame. The narrator decides what to include, what to leave out, how to connect different ideas together within a particular frame. But we also saw that when we have an unreliable narrator, we need to be careful about who is constructing the frame, why they're constructing it that way, what is being left outside of the frame that we might want to ask about. I want to do one more thought experiment. Back in the 1960s, psychologist Peter Waysand came up with this test. And in it, he asked students, he would write these 3 numbers on the board in front of a classroom, and he would ask students to guess the secret rule that he used for selecting these numbers and putting them in this order. And rather than saying out loud, I think your rule is this, the way they had to test that rule was to give 3 other numbers in a sequence and ask him, does this fit the rule? And he would say either yes or no. So they couldn't just ask what the rule was or just guess what the rule was. They actually had to test the rule. And most people would test this rule this way. If Waysand chose the numbers 2, 4, 6, they would say, okay, 8, 10, 12, or 14, 16, 18, or 92, 94, 96. And in all of these cases, Peter Waysand would say, yes, those sequences follow the rule that I'm following. Are you ready to guess what my rule is? And everybody said yes. Majority of people would say, yes, I know what the rule is. The rule is 3 numbers increasing by 2 each time. And then Waysand would say, no, that's not the rule. And people would be surprised. Wait a second, that has to be the rule. We've just confirmed it. And they had confirmed something. They had confirmed the rule that was in their head. The problem was confirming something isn't actually testing it. Every now and then a student would guess a sequence like 1, 2, 3, or 6, 4, 2, the same 3 numbers except backwards, or something like 1, 17, 133. And when they did this, they would sometimes get a surprising answer. 1, 2, 3 actually did fit the rule. 6, 4, 2 did not fit the rule, and 1, 17, 133 did fit the rule. So the people that were thinking, oh, it's just increasing by 2 each time, they would look at 1, 2, 3 and say, well, that shouldn't be right. It's almost as if Peter Waysand got the rule wrong. Or 1, 17, 133, that can't possibly be right. That's not increasing by 2 every time. They were surprised that they were wrong because they had just confirmed 3 times, or in this example, 3 times there had been some sort of confirmation of a different rule that should not have been confirmed by those other ones. But in this case, all 3 of those bottom numbers are actually deliberately, or people were trying to be wrong. Instead of trying to confirm the rule that they guessed, they were trying to falsify it. And this is what psychologists call confirmation bias, we're much more likely to test something by trying to validate our rule or the pattern we think we see or the frame that we believe is appropriate. We rarely try to falsify our beliefs. We rarely try to say, I think this is going to come out wrong, but I need to try it just in case. Because when you have a rule in your head, when you have a pattern that you think you see, and you look for evidence that shouldn't be there, and it turns out that it is there, that's just as important, or actually much more important, than confirming the pattern you thought you saw. So falsification is the way that modern science works. And this, in one form or another, goes back to Francis Bacon, who I mentioned earlier as being someone that people thought may have written some of Shakespeare's works. The scientific method doesn't look to find evidence that confirms a hypothesis. It looks for ways to disconfirm a hypothesis, to falsify that hypothesis. And if attempts to falsify that hypothesis fail, then you're doing pretty good. You can go from being a hypothesis to being a theory. But notice confirmation is not enough. If we believe that the sun orbits the earth rather than the other way around, we can confirm that. Every morning, walk outside, look east, you'll see the sun coming up. You'll watch the sun go over to the west and settle there at the end of the day. So that confirms the belief that the sun moves and the earth is still. But of course, if you look up at the sky, like the planet Venus throughout the year, it's never rising and setting in the same place, so that doesn't quite make sense. So if you look for counter evidence, you're in a better position to be certain than you are if you've never looked for counter evidence. So I've introduced 4 principles from psychology to talk about Shakespeare. And you may be thinking, why we have to do more psychology again? But in this case, I hope it starts to become obvious. We're going to look at this psychology play itself out, and we're going to ask ourselves, why didn't Othello try falsification? Why was Othello just looking for ocular proof, looking to just confirm what he was already led to believe by Iago? Understanding these quirks in human cognition, and these are quirks that are just as true in Shakespeare's time as they are in ours, and were probably true 100,000 years before Shakespeare's time. These quirks in human cognition create these framing effects. And Kahneman defines framing effects as large changes of preferences that are sometimes caused by inconsequential variations in the wording of a choice problem. So remember what's more likely, a California earthquake causing a flood or just a flood? Choosing certain words makes an illogical answer seem more realistic. Kahneman points out that different ways of presenting the same information often evoke different emotions. We definitely see Iago able to manipulate certain emotions by the way he presents them. Framing effects have an unjustified influence on the formation of beliefs and preferences. And unless there's an obvious reason to do otherwise, most of us passively accept the decision problems as they are framed, and therefore rarely have an opportunity to discover the extent to which our preferences are frame-bound rather than reality-bound. In other words, we rarely ask ourselves, how are we framing this new information? Or how are other people framing that new information for us? And one very common way that information is framed for us, even though we're thinking about something in particular for the first time, that information may already be framed, and that is by metaphors in the language. Now, I haven't talked about metaphor in a long time, partly because nearly everything we've read has been in translation, and that means a lot of the original metaphors get lost, and some English language metaphors creep in the translation that weren't actually there. But in this case, you're reading this in the original language, so we can notice certain metaphors, certain figures of speech in which a comparison is made or an identity is asserted between two unrelated things or actions without the use of like or as. And the words like or as are less important than the fact that a metaphor doesn't call attention to itself as a comparison, but it is a comparison. We want to distinguish between the two components of a metaphor, the tenor and the vehicle. The tenor is the thing that's being described. The vehicle is the thing to which it's being compared, the imagery that's being used to describe that thing. And these sorts of things creep into our language, they creep into our associations, they make different things seem more coherent, not because they actually fit together in reality, but because we're just used to using these metaphors implicitly. The example I used in the metaphor lecture was thinking of a university education as a trip to the store, where the students are customers and education is like a thing, a commodity you can just take off the shelf and put in your basket and go to the checkout and pay your money and that's it. But that's a bad metaphor because in that metaphor, students don't actually have to do anything. There's no effort required. There's no effort required from a customer except to show up. And sometimes if you order it online, you don't even have to do that. You just pay the money. That's not really effort. So if we compare the university to a gym, let's say it's a gym that you have to pay for. Let's say that's not the Dugan Center. That's actually, you're going to Gold's Gym across town. You're actually having to spend money on that, but then spending the money isn't going to make you stronger. It's not going to make you more healthy. You actually have to show up. You actually have to work for it. So if we change our metaphors, all of a sudden there's a whole sort of different frame that we're using to look at our education. But a lot of those frames are there even though we don't notice them. And this is why the linguist George Lakoff and the philosopher Mark Johnson say that because the metaphorical concept is systematic, the language we use to talk about that aspect of the concept is also systematic. And this very systematicity that allows us to comprehend one aspect of a concept in terms of another will necessarily hide other aspects of that concept. So it's framing it. It's saying, focus on this, but ignore this other thing. In allowing us to focus on one aspect of a concept, metaphorical concept can keep us from focusing on other aspects of the concept that are inconsistent with that metaphor. So metaphors are one way that words can frame new information. Frame information by focusing us on some aspects, but actually hiding other aspects from us. And it does it even when no one else uses these metaphors to deceive us. We can deceive ourselves by the metaphors we use. And it seems that nobody knows this better than Iago. Now, part of Shakespeare's genius is his use of metaphors throughout his works. But remember, there's no narration in a Shakespeare play. That means that all of these metaphors aren't necessarily Shakespeare saying, I think this is the way the world is, but one of Shakespeare's characters saying, I think this is the way the world is. And as we'll see with Iago, those metaphors can be used to provoke emotional responses and immediate instinctual frames. And there's probably no more visceral and vulgar metaphor in Othello, and who knows, maybe not in Shakespeare either, than when Iago and Rodrigo are standing outside Brabantio's window. Remember that Brabantio is Desdemona's father. And Desdemona is off eloping with Othello. They're getting married. They're exchanging wedding vows. But the way Iago describes it is he yells to Desdemona's father, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. In this metaphor, he is making a comparison, and it's a comparison that frames what's actually happening, but it does so in such a way that takes this very innocent elopement, this marriage between two people who are in love with each other, and it compares it to two sheep having sex. It makes it much more animalistic, much more carnal, much more vulgar than the thing it's actually describing. And of course it brings in the color difference here. But that doesn't, as I mentioned earlier, the distinctions about race aren't exactly then what they are now. But in this particular metaphor, you don't want a black ram and a white ewe copulating if you're selling the wool. You want the wool to be as white as possible because it can take on more colors that way. It can be more easily dyed, whereas dark wool is always going to be dark. You can only dye it another dark shade. So if you're actually thinking in economic terms, then this white ewe, this female sheep, is going to have lambs whose wool is not going to be marketable. But the vulgarity here is clearly very, very deliberate on Iago's part. It is intended to get Brabantio angry, emotional, and irrational. He wants Brabantio angry at Othello. And he doesn't stop with the black ram, white ewe metaphor. He says, you'll have your daughter covered with a Barbary horse. Covered in this case means, again, breeding. The Barbary horse, remember that the Barbary coast is where Othello's from. This is the northwest African coast. So again, he's making it very clear that this is Othello and Desdemona, but he finds yet another animal metaphor. And one of the most famous vulgar lines in Shakespeare is, he says, your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs. So if you imagine two people having sex, there's, on one side is one of their backs and the other side is another of their backs. So they're making one animal. It's not like, a union of souls or something like that. No, this is like the two of them go together and just make this animal. All three of these metaphors describe an actual marriage, but they're describing it just in terms of animal sex. You can imagine what kind of emotional response this is going to have from Brabantio. But not just the emotion. The emotion is then going to frame everything that happens next. So what Brabantio is about to learn is the truth. That is, that his daughter is married to his friend Othello. We're going to find out that Brabantio and Othello had great respect for each other. So this is the kind of thing which, if it was described as exactly what it is, as a marriage, as an elopement, he might be angry that they didn't make it a public affair, that this is happening without his immediate consent or something like that. But the way he's actually going to respond to it when he's first shown this information, when Othello actually does tell him, yes, we are now married, he is already framing everything with Iago's imagery, the animal sex imagery that Iago chose, that is priming him with. Not only is Iago framing this illicit or secret marriage for Brabantio, but Shakespeare is actually priming us before we've met Othello for the first time, before we've seen him speak on his own behalf. But that is going to be completely upended when we actually see Othello and we hear him speak for himself. So among his first lines are when Brabantio is coming to find him, and he's bringing these armed guards with him. Iago tells Othello that he needs to go hide because these men are coming after you. And Othello says, let him do his spite. My services, which I have done the signatory, in other words, the lords of Venice, shall out-tongue his complaints. In other words, my reputation precedes me and speaks for me. I don't need to hide. I don't need to be deceptive. They know who I am, and that's enough to represent me against whatever accusations this person is making against me. 'Tis yet to know which, when I know that boasting is an honor, I shall promulgate. I fetch my life and being from men of royal siege, and my demerits may speak unbonneted to his proud of fortune, as this that I have reached for no Iago, but that I love the gentle Desdemona. What he's saying is, if I needed to brag, if I needed to explain myself, I would remind people that I do come from an aristocratic background. And my demerits, we use the term demerit now just to mean like a negative mark, but at this point it just meant any kind of mark, any kind of reputation. And in his reputation happens to be very good. My demerits speak unbonneted to his proud of fortune, as this I have reached. So the marks, the things by which I am known will show that I'm an honorable person and I'm not guilty of whatever he seems to be accusing me of, and that I love Desdemona, and I'm not going to hide that fact. I'm not going to taint my relationship with Desdemona with lies and hiding and deceit. He says, I must be found. In other words, I'm not going to hide. I must be found. I want people to see me. I want people to see that I am honest. My parts, my title, my perfect soul shall manifest me rightly. Manifest being, the opposite of hiding, to show. I need to be seen so that who I am can show through. This is the most honest person, and the most honest speech from the most honest type of person we can imagine. And his confidence is such that, we learn very quickly that he is a very accomplished general, that he is someone who has done a lot for the Republic of Venice, but we presume that Iago is someone who's also, part of the military of Venice and has been in a lot of battles as well. But we're going to see the distinction between Iago's deceptiveness and Othello's virtue. And Othello's virtue isn't just his honesty, but it's also his gentleness, his withholding force, even when he's confronted by these armed guards. They're sticking their swords in his face, and he says, keep up your bright swords. In other words, put them back in the sheath, put them up. Keep up your bright swords, for the dew will rust them. In other words, there's not going to be any fighting here. He's not defensive. He's not. He doesn't have the look of a guilty person or even of a person who's worried. He knows that there's not going to be a fight for whatever reason, whether it's that he's guilty of something, and presumably because if there was going to be a fight, he would win. So there's just sort of no chance of these guys actually doing anything with those swords. And he says to Brabantio, good signor, you shall more command with your years than with your weapons. In other words, you also should speak through who you are, through your experience, through the respect people have for you, through the respect I have for you. You will command me not because you have these guards here, but because I respect you. I respect you for your years, for your service, for the friendship we've had over the years. Notice how much Othello resembles Aeneas here. This is someone with pietas. This is someone who is loyal. He is loyal to the people whom he serves, the Republic of Venice. He is reserved. He does not let his furor out. He is very much in control of his emotions when, at a time when it would seem that he has the opportunity and the justification to react, to either be afraid or be angry or be insulted. He is none of those things. He knows he's honest. He knows his virtues are known, and he's going to let his reputation speak for himself, and he's not at all worried about that. This reputation and the impact it has is very much connected to this idea of kleos, the idea of dome in Old English. Remember, the dome meaning judgment, but it means the judgment of other people. It's how you're known. People know what you've done in the past, and they use that to judge you. And if you've done all of these good things, which Othello has, they're going to judge you well. So you need not be afraid of dome, of judgment, of what people say. You've got the kleos, and in this case, Othello has won his kleos on the battlefield. But remember, kleos is also the things said, or what people say about you. And he has earned it. Now he's going to, it's sort of this social capital, and now he's got plenty of it to spare with whatever accusation Brabantio wants to bring. But it's for this reason, it seems, because Othello is so honest, because he's so upfront with everything. He doesn't conceal anything. This is why it seems that he's the antithesis of Iago, but it's also why he's so vulnerable to Iago. People a lot of times will read Othello and say, oh, clearly this is showing how naive this military general is. Or maybe this is showing that Shakespeare thought people of African descent were more emotional and reactive and jealous and that sort of thing. But notice how when everybody else at the beginning is bursting with emotion, Othello is very calm. And this is the most virtuous person. He's the one who most resembles people like Aeneas. He resembles people like El Cid. Remember when El Cid should, or would have been justified in killing the Carrions, or even, turning on against King Alfonso. When he had been wronged, he didn't immediately respond with violence, even though he had the opportunity. It was his honesty, his patience, his sort of gentleness of character that won out in the end. And we would like to see that happen with Othello, but we have this new character of Iago to deal with, and this is very similar to that line in the Aeneid when Aeneas is telling the story of the Trojan horse, and this Greek named Sinon has to communicate this lie. He has to hang around with the horse and tell the Trojans that, oh, if you only take it into the walls of Troy, the gods will then be on your side and the Greeks will lose. And he's able to lie to them. I mean, he does come up with a pretty convincing story, a pretty good use of theory of mind, but he's able to lie to them according to Aeneas. Aeneas says that the Trojans, we believed him because we were honest. We were men of virtue. We were not the kind of people who would just lie to each other. We would win our battles on the battlefield, not through deception. Because we were honest, we assumed other men were honest. And that ends up being the downfall of Troy. But it's not something that's criticized in the Aeneid. Aeneas is still virtuous because he opened himself up to deception, because his honesty made him vulnerable. You have to be really strong to be vulnerable and to be open and still survive. But what Shakespeare is going to confront us with is that vulnerability is still there. That virtue of character opens you up to the maliciousness, to the lies of other people, especially when you depend on reputation. You depend on other people seeing you a certain way. Other people see you framed by certain good deeds, rather than having that frame manipulated by somebody like Iago. But despite how open, honest, and patient Othello is, when Brabantio learns about this wedding, he's not looking at it as a wedding. He's not even looking at it as an elopement. The fact that it was secret doesn't seem to be the problem he has. He already has this frame constructed by him, or constructed in his mind by Iago's animal sex metaphors. And so he's angry, and that anger is going to continue to look for justification. So he starts to generate his own narrative to explain this marriage. Rather than admitting that his daughter could have fallen in love with Othello, he says, Damned as thou art, to Othello, thou hast enchanted her. If she in chains of magic were not bound, so opposed to marriage that she shunned the wealthy curled darlings of our nation, 'tis probable and palpable to thinking. In other words, she didn't want to marry anyone, otherwise she would have married one of these young native Venetians, one of these Venetian noblemen that are her age and her race and her nationality. Rather than you. If she didn't want to marry them, surely she wouldn't have wanted to marry you. She wouldn't have married you voluntarily. He can't see that, well, maybe she didn't want to marry them because she wanted to marry Othello. This is why she didn't want to marry the young Venetian nobleman. She already had her ideal husband in mind. We're going to see that explanation come from both Othello and Desdemona, but Brabantio can't see that. Brabantio has already generated this idea that she didn't want to marry these other younger guys. She married Othello, therefore Othello, being an African, must know some magic that he's used to brainwash her. That means that Othello and Desdemona have to compete with that frame. They have to give an alternative narrative, an alternative explanation for why the two of them got married. And Othello tells Brabantio and the rest of the nobles of Venice that I have taken away this old man's daughter. It is most true. I have married her. He admits, yes, we have gotten married. That part of it is true. Her father loved me, often invited me, still questioned me in the story of my life from year to year, the battles, the sieges, the fortunes that I have passed. He's saying that Brabantio and I have been friends. He loved me and he wanted to hear the stories about my past conquest and battles and that sort of thing. I ran it through even from my boyish days, so he tells his life story from the time he was a boy. This to hear would Desdemona seriously incline. So while he's telling Brabantio this story of his life, Desdemona, Brabantio's daughter, is listening in to this story. This to hear would Desdemona seriously incline. She thanked me and bade me, if I had a friend that loved her, I should but teach him how to tell my story, and that would woo her. Upon this hint I spake. So she tells him, well, you know, if you had a friend that had stories like that, all he'd have to do is tell me those stories and I'd fall in love with him. So, you know, this is again theory of mind. She's saying not directly, I'm falling in love with you, but you know, if you have a friend that's exactly like you, so she drops the hint, he picks up on the hint. And so upon this hint I spake, she loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them. This only is the witchcraft I have used. So he takes that witchcraft priming, that witchcraft metaphor, or that witchcraft accusation that has been primed by Brabantio, and says, okay, if I used witchcraft, it was the witchcraft of telling my story. And Desdemona confirms this frame, and she extends this frame to remind Brabantio of the fact that he, you know, took another man's daughter away from her, and you know, when he took his wife, her mother. She says, my noble father, I do perceive here a divided duty. To you I am bound for life and education. In other words, bound for the fact that he gave her life and gave her an education. My life and education both do learn me how to respect you. So I have learned the proper respect that's due to a father. You are the lord of my duty. I am hitherto your daughter, but here's my husband. And so much duty as my mother showed to you, preferring you before her father, so much I challenge that I may profess due to the Moor my lord. She still refers to him as the Moor, but I guess that's how people are describing him there. But she's reminding him that now that I'm married, my duty is to my husband first and to my father second. That I did love the Moor to live with him, my downright violence and storm of fortune, may the trumpet to the world, my heart subdued, even to the very quality of my lord. I saw Othello's visage in his mind, and to his honor and to his valiant parts did I my soul and fortunes consecrate. Some critics point out that at this point we have what looks like a comedy, and a Shakespearean comedy usually ends in a marriage, and that's where Act 1 ends. We have this trouble brewing between these two newlyweds, but the newlyweds through their love are able to show everyone that we're now married, we love each other, here's why, let's all be happy and live happily ever after. Unfortunately, as we know, this is not going to be a happily ever after type of marriage, but it's through no fault of these two. Othello and Desdemona right now are this sort of ideal married couple. The reason there's not going to be a happily ever after is because of Iago. Now, to understand Iago, we get a lot more depth to this character. He's a much more complex character. Maybe he's even more interesting precisely because Desdemona and Othello are so easy to understand. Their honesty as characters actually makes them a little bit less interesting because we pretty much know all we need to know about them. We know that we would trust them if they were actual people, and we know that we would not trust Iago. But as far as a puzzle to sort of figure out, and the one who's actually doing and creating the majority of the action, Iago actually has a lot more development as a character. The problem is we're never really sure how to interpret him. What's his motivation? Why does he want to destroy Othello and Desdemona? Well, he says at first that it's because he was going to become Othello's lieutenant. He was going to be promoted, but instead Cassio was the one that was promoted. In personal suit to make me his lieutenant, I know my price. I am worth no worse a place. So he's angry about this, being passed over by Cassio, who's this sort of straight out of ROTC. He's described as being all theory. He's good at sort of the mathematics of the battlefield, but he doesn't have the experience on the battlefield that Iago has. But then later he says, I hate the Moor, and it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he has done my office. In other words, that he has been sleeping with Emilia, Iago's wife. Well, that's new, and he doesn't say what he bases that on. He just says that it is thought abroad, that somebody somewhere thinks this. And he says, I know not if it be true, but I, from mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety. In other words, I don't know if it's true, but just thinking about it, I want to get revenge on him. And then later again he says, I do suspect the lusty Moor high leaped into my seat, the thought whereof doth like a poisonous mineral gnaw my inwards. So just this idea that he might have slept with Emilia tends to just enrages Iago's jealousy. And this seems to be why he knows how jealousy works. He knows that just this idea is just pushing him to do something awful. He knows if he plants a similar idea in Othello's head, that it's going to push Othello into a vulnerable position. He admits a certain amount of his methods, at least, to Rodrigo. Rodrigo, who is or was in love with Desdemona, or still is in love with Desdemona, but has been rejected both by Desdemona and by Brabantio. Brabantio says, I've already told you can't pursue my daughter. And he wants to change that. And Iago knows enough about Rodrigo's thinking to sort of lead him along. Say, well, if you do this, you might be able to win Desdemona. You might at least be able to break up Othello and Desdemona. And Rodrigo says, well, don't you serve Othello? And he says, Iago says, I follow Othello to serve my turn upon him. Though I do hate him, as I do hell pains, I must show out a flag, a sign of love, which is indeed but a sign. And this showing signs rather than showing realities is sort of what Iago is. It's what makes him deceptive. But notice he's not just telling a lie. He's giving little signs, little priming. The signs that he's putting out there are just signs to provoke, to prime, to frame, to set up Othello's thinking. And he's able to do this because, as Iago says, he holds me well. The better shall my purpose work on him. Cassio's a proper man. Let me see now. To get his place and to plume up my will and double knavery, how? How am I going to do this? Let's see. After some time, to abuse Othello's ear, that he is too familiar with his wife, I'm going to tell Othello that Cassio's a little too familiar with Desdemona. They're maybe getting a little too friendly. He hath a person and a smooth disposed to be suspected, framed to make women false. In other words, Cassio's a good-looking guy, or he's a ladies' man. He's the kind of guy who would cheat or sleep with another man's wife, or it would be easy for him. Notice how Iago is using types. He's not necessarily getting too deep into the theory of mind of the people he's thinking about. He knows that Othello might fall for this stereotype. If Othello thinks of Cassio as this stereotype, who's kind of a ladies' man, who's the kind of guy who could seduce Desdemona, then that stereotype is going to have a lot of power in Othello's mind, according to Iago. The Moor is of a free and open nature that thinks men honest, but seem to be so. In other words, like Aeneas said about the Trojans, because he's honest, he thinks other people are honest. And will tenderly be led by the nose, as asses are, as donkeys are. You can just lead them by, putting something they want right in front of them. I haven't. This isn't I have not. This is I have it. I have it. It is engendered. Hell and night must bring this monstrous birth to world's light. In that capping couplet, he's talking about how he's giving birth to a monster. Later, he's going to identify it as the green-eyed monster. We still use that phrase today. So again, we have our characters, and these characters are becoming, now that Iago has this idea, these are almost sort of chess pieces that are on a board that he needs to position. He can't just say, Othello, here's how you're supposed to think about Cassio. He has to actually put Cassio in a position to be interpreted a certain way, or the same way that knowing that Othello and Desdemona were going to be together and that Brabantio was going to learn this soon, he was able to frame Brabantio's view of that marriage. Now he's got to be even more clever and create this even larger design. So the first act let us know how Iago primes people with metaphors and with images, with just little hints of thoughts rather than entire declarative sentences, so that frames the things that they actually do see. He actually has to have these characters witness something that fits within this frame. So there's two parts to his lie. It's not just a sentence, it is the priming that creates the frame, but then they actually have to see something in that frame that they're able to misinterpret to Iago's advantage. So first he has to get Cassio and Desdemona interacting together so that will be something that Othello can see and be framed. Well, he does this. This is a very long game that he starts in Act 3 when he gets Rodrigo to pick a fight with Cassio, and he also gets Cassio drunk. So Cassio is drunk, and then he goes on to watch duty, and he doesn't want to admit that he's drunk, and he gets angry when people say that he's drunk. Then Rodrigo says something to him off stage, but he picks a fight with him, and when Montano, the governor of Cyprus, steps in to break up this fight, Cassio wounds Montano. And then Iago tells Rodrigo to go raise an alarm. So Rodrigo starts yelling, mutiny, mutiny. That means that the soldiers, the Venetian soldiers, are turning against their proper authority. This brings Othello out. So this just yelling mutiny frames something that wasn't actually a mutiny. Cassio and Montano were just sort of drunk guys brawling with each other. But when Othello sees that, he sees that as his men are fighting with each other. That must confirm this charge of mutiny that's just been yelled. He doesn't even know who said it. He doesn't know it was Rodrigo. He doesn't know how it started. And once he asks people what's happened here, Cassio doesn't really want to tell him. Montano, it seems, doesn't really want to tell him. So he asks Iago, honest Iago. He keeps calling him honest Iago, which we see is very ironic. But Iago, notice, has this opportunity to say, that guy you promoted over me, Cassio, he's actually a drunk. He picked a fight with the governor of Cyprus. You should definitely kick him out of his position, give me the position. Iago could, if all he wanted was Cassio's position, he has an opportunity to take that right now. But notice that his lie depends on continuing to be trusted and to be seen as the kind of person who would not slander another person, even if that other person did something wrong. And so Iago is hesitant to actually say that Cassio wounded Montano because he's drunk, or that it's in any way his fault. And Othello falls for this. Othello continues to think of Iago as honest Iago. He says, I know, Iago, thy honesty and thy love doth mince this matter. In other words, I know you want to be honest, but I know you also are a good friend to Cassio. So you're making it light to Cassio. You're trying to make Cassio look good because you're such a good guy, Iago. We all love you for that, but I have to be the general here. I have to, institute discipline. And he tells Cassio, Cassio, I love thee, but never more be officer of mine. So Cassio has lost his rank. And Cassio reminds us how important reputation is. And he says it 3 times, reputation, reputation, reputation. Oh, I have lost my reputation. I have lost the immortal part of myself. This should seem familiar. The reputation, the dome, the kleos that lives on after you're gone. This is what these warriors from the Iliad and from Hrolf Kraki's saga and Beowulf, this is what they fight and die for. Because after they die, if they are remembered well, if they are judged well after their death, then that is the closest thing to immortality they're going to get. Again, this doesn't take into account any kind of afterlife. It just says, on earth, the immortal part of myself is my reputation, and I've just lost that. What remains is bestial. In other words, I'm just an animal now. I'm just this sort of material, biological substance that's going to rot if I die because I've lost this immortal part of myself, my reputation. And again, he says it twice. And notice what Iago says. I'm going to come back to this at the very end because it's an open question. Iago asks, or says, as I am an honest man, and we know he's not an honest man, but he needs Cassio to think he's an honest man. As I am an honest man, I thought that you had received some bodily wound. There's more sense in that than your reputation. In other words, I thought you were wounded or something. You're just worried about your reputation. That's no big deal. He's framing this in exactly the opposite way. That losing your reputation is no big deal. But if your animal substance, your biological substance, if your body had been wounded, that would be something to cry about. But reputation is an idol and a most false imposition, oft got without merit and lost without deserving. You have lost no reputation at all unless you repute yourself such a loser. In other words, you create your own reputation. It's almost as if Cassio can deny that he's done anything wrong, and he will maintain that reputation. We would like to think that's not true. We would like to think that people could see the falsehood of a boasting liar who makes himself look like a better person than he really is. We would hope people could tell the difference between that and someone who had actually earned their reputation. But what Iago is telling Cassio is no, you can just decide what your reputation is going to be, and you've never lost it until you think you have. But this is all leading up to his setup. He needs to get Cassio interacting not with Othello, but with Desdemona. So this is when he tells him the plan to get back his lieutenantship. He says, I'll tell you what you shall do. Our general's wife, Othello's wife, Desdemona, is now the general. Confess yourself freely to her, importune her help to put you in your place again. In other words, now that Desdemona is married to Othello, she can persuade him to do what she wants. And if she wants you reinstated, she can work on Othello until he does that. So what Cassio is going to think with this idea is that, oh yes, that's a good idea. I'll get her to change Othello's mind and respect me again. But of course, what Iago wants is for Desdemona to be constantly talking about Cassio to Othello so that he could frame this interaction as evidence, confirmation of an affair between the two. So Iago says in his soliloquy, which is addressed to the audience, his inner thoughts being expressed to us, whiles this honest fool plies Desdemona to repair his fortunes, and she for him pleads strongly to the Moor, I'll pour this pestilence in his ear, that she repeals him for her body's lust. And by how much she strives to do him good, she shall undo her credit with the Moor. In other words, he knows that Desdemona is a good person, that she's going to want to help Cassio. He's going to use her compassionate disposition to make her look guilty of having an affair. And we see this is a really terrible person, but we also know as soon as he says it how likely that is to work. So Iago has to do two things. He has to set in motion a sort of chain reaction of interactions between people, and then also he has to generate a narrative to give to Othello that Othello is then going to use to frame the things that he sees happen before him. So he says two things are to be done. My wife must move for Cassio to her mistress. I'll set her on it. In other words, Emilia, who is Desdemona's servant, needs to try to get Desdemona to try to persuade Othello to reinstate Cassio. Myself, the while, to draw the Moor apart and to bring him jump when he may find Cassio, soliciting his wife. Aye, that's the way, dull not devised by coldness and delay. In other words, I've got to get Othello to see Cassio and Desdemona interacting with each other after I've led him to believe something's going on. And then there's the handkerchief. We have this objective correlative. I've used that term before, but it's this object that, like Tizone and Collada, the swords in El Cid, if we follow these objects from person to person, we see really the sort of heart of the action of what's taking place. And there's this handkerchief with these sort of strawberries sewn onto it that Othello got from his mother, and he gave it to Desdemona. So this is something that he would definitely recognize, definitely have an emotional attachment toward. And if somehow Cassio could get that, and Othello see Cassio in that possession of it, that would frame these actual interactions, would frame it in this false narrative of this affair. So he says, I will in Cassio's lodging lose this napkin, he's talking about the handkerchief, and let him find it. It's very important that Iago doesn't just run up to Cassio and say, here, take this handkerchief. Cassio can't know that this thing belongs to Othello. It needs to be something that he's caught with. And trifles light as air, or to the jealous, confirmations strong as proofs of holy writ. So once primed, confirmation bias is going to work in Iago's favor. This handkerchief is going to be the confirmation, the ocular proof that Othello is later going to demand. And it's going to be as effective as Holy Writ, and in other words, the Word of God. It's going to be as effective as sort of reading in the Bible that Cassio and Desdemona are to be trusted. The Moor already changes with my poison, with the priming that I've given him. Dangerous conceits are, in their natures, poisons, which at first are scarce found to distaste, but with a little act upon the blood, burn like mines of sulfur. A metaphor, but in this case a metaphor about a metaphor, that he's slipped in these priming associations that frame what Othello sees, and each of these things that's about to happen is going to confirm something that's not actually true, but that Iago has sort of set up in Othello's mind. And this is what we see play out over the last two acts. Othello sees Cassio speaking to Desdemona and then leaving when he approaches, because in Cassio's mind we understand that he doesn't want Othello to know that he's asking Desdemona to speak on his behalf. That would seem underhanded. But what Othello thinks is that he's being even more underhanded, that he's sneaking around with his wife. Desdemona does want Cassio to be reinstated, and she speaks to Othello on his behalf, but that again confirms what Othello has been led to believe. Iago claims that Cassio confessed to sleeping with Desdemona. He tells Othello that Cassio and I were sleeping next to each other, because it was very common at this time for people to share beds, just because there weren't that many around. Beds were sort of a luxury. But the two of them were sleeping together, and while Cassio was asleep, he thought Iago was Desdemona, and he turns over to him and says, "Curse the Moor," and puts his leg over him, that sort of thing. Of course, Iago is making all this up. And this is the only just complete lie Iago gives. Notice how that if Iago just told this story by itself, that probably wouldn't get Othello as emotionally unstable, and it wouldn't frame much of it. It wouldn't have anything to frame. It would just be, this guy said this happened, and maybe that's something to pay attention to, maybe not. But by the time he tells it, that's just one drop in the bucket. That's just one element in this frame that has all of these other sort of confirmations. Then Othello sees Iago and Cassio talking about a lover, and he thinks they're talking about Desdemona, but they're actually talking about Bianca. Othello doesn't know anything about Bianca, but Bianca is this courtesan with whom Cassio is having this relationship. And if he was saying the things about Desdemona that he's saying about Bianca, then everything Othello thinks is going to be justified. Othello just can't hear that this is about Bianca. Bianca is out of the frame. And then, of course, Cassio has Desdemona's handkerchief. If none of the other things were set up, that object seems to be the ocular proof. But notice in this case, it follows all of these other things that seem to confirm the frame that Iago has set up. And so this is all quite an impressive feat of theory of mind on Iago's part. He didn't just deceive Othello into thinking that Desdemona thought something. He had to manipulate Cassio's thinking about Othello. He had to manipulate Emilia's thinking about him, thinking about Cassio. He had to manipulate Desdemona's thinking about Cassio and thinking about how she was going to change Othello's thinking. He has to create a lot of frames within frames to convince people to do certain things and say certain things so that those things can be misinterpreted by Othello. So we definitely don't want to do what some people seem to do and say, well, Iago was dishonest and Othello was gullible. So it was Othello's gullibility or his jealousy that were his tragic flaw. And that term is a problematic term. It comes from a mistranslation of the Greek word hamartia. When Aristotle describes how tragedy works, he says frequently there's this, the tragic hero has this hamartia, which means literally missing the mark. Like, think of it, archery. If you shoot at an archery target and you miss the mark, that might have some sort of consequences. If it's in a battle and you fire a shot at your enemy and you miss, then you're in grave danger. And that's a single action. That's the way Aristotle describes it. But it gets mistranslated in the 20th century to be like this internal characteristic that the hero always has. So like a defining characteristic, as if Othello was defined by his jealousy or defined by gullibility. But remember from Act 1, Othello is not an emotional person. He is a very patient person. He is given the opportunity to respond emotionally, and he doesn't do it. He's also a very honest person and a very a strategically intelligent person when it comes to battle. But as a general, he has to trust his troops. And he's also shown that he's not so gullible that he would just trust anybody. He cares very much about Michael Cassio. Michael Cassio is somebody that he has promoted, but when it appears to him that Cassio has done something wrong, he is going to punish Cassio for that. So this is not just a pushover. This is not somebody that's gullible. And this is not somebody who was jealous before Iago's machinations. All of this change in people comes from Iago, this slow, gradual process of priming and framing and setting up these framing effects, and then doing that with people to position them within a larger frame that he's creating for Othello. And within that frame, he gives them these little pieces of evidence to trigger that confirmation bias. These are things that work on all of us. And even if Shakespeare didn't have the terms, the psychological terms that we have today, we see that this is all part of this long game that Iago plays over the entire play. So this is all Iago. This is not a weakness on Othello's part. Any of us could have been Othello. In fact, the reason I compared him to Aeneas and to El Cid is because he is this sort of ideal hero. But even the ideal hero can be led into this downfall. And this is one of the things that really makes Othello this great tragedy. Tragedy in the Aristotelian sense of containing these people who are better than normal, but they have this even larger fall because they stand so high above the rest of us, because somebody like Othello is really the kind of person a lot of us aspire to be. Even he can be brought down by this external circumstance, namely Iago. And that brings me back to that line that Iago said to Cassio. Reputation is an idle and most false imposition, oft got without merit and lost without deserving. It's this kleos, this dome, this thing that we've seen so many heroes and so many stories that we've, and so many narratives, so many poems and plays that we've read. This is the thing that they fight for. This is the thing that once earned is supposed to be your immortality. This is the thing that ultimately tells us who we can trust and who we can't, what groups we want to be a part of, who we can depend on, and what kind of people we should be. If we follow these other icons and try to match their kleos, even if it's in the attempt, it's supposed to make us a better person in these other narratives. But now Shakespeare is asking us, well, is that something we can actually do? Can we achieve a reputation that somebody else can't take away? That line, it's important to remember, comes from Iago, and we should not trust Iago. So we can't say Shakespeare is saying that reputation is an idle and most false imposition. We can't say that this is the moral of the story, because Shakespeare doesn't give us a moral, or he gives us so many morals that conflict with each other that it's clear that it's not going to be that simple. He puts on one side this sort of honest virtue, the kleos of, or the reputation of Othello, the honesty and the sort of martial prowess matched with a patient and gentle nature of Othello, as well as the virtue of Desdemona. Desdemona does everything right, everything she's supposed to, everything her culture has told her to be. Emilia even is very intelligent. She's, one of the things I've suggested that in your papers you could compare Emilia to the wife of Bath, because in her dialogues with Desdemona, she's very much aware about how women are treated and their reputations are manipulated by men. And women are held to a standard that men are not held to. She calls that double standard that, men are allowed to go off and have affairs and that sort of thing. That one thing would destroy a woman's reputation. Emilia is very intelligent, not naive. If you wanted to say that Desdemona was sweet but she was naive, well, you can't say that about Emilia. But even Emilia gets fooled by Iago. She figures out it was Iago eventually, but she still wants to get along with her husband. She wants to trust her husband. And that is something that Iago uses, manipulates, and throws her away at the end. He eventually kills her trying to keep his secret. So Shakespeare takes that sort of cunning social intelligence theory of mind, that sort of Machiavellian recognition that the good guys don't always win, and sometimes you have to resort to these measures that somebody like Aeneas or El Cid would never resort to. But that doesn't mean Shakespeare is advocating that. But what he is definitely doing is calling attention to a storyteller. In this case, the storyteller within Othello is Iago. And in doing that, he calls attention to the dangers of storytelling, the way stories can manipulate reality, frame reality, get us thinking about things that aren't real. The things that Daniel Kahneman warned us about at the beginning of the lecture, but all the way at the beginning of the semester, I mentioned what Nassim Nicholas Taleb called the narrative fallacy. When we take information and we add this beginning and middle and end and this assumption about cause and effect without actually trying to falsify those assumptions about cause and effect, we create these narratives, and those narratives can be deceptive. But he says, well, how are we going to show people that narratives are deceptive unless we do it through narrative itself? And so he says there may be a way to use narrative, but for a good purpose. Only a diamond can cut a diamond. We can use our ability to convince with a story that conveys the right message, and that's what storytellers do. They use stories and vignettes to illustrate our gullibility about stories and our preference for the dangerous compression of narrative. You need a story to displace a story. So if Iago is using these stories to bring this downfall of these good people, we could say that Shakespeare is using the story of Othello to warn us. There are people like Iago who use stories against you, who shape your ability to think about reality, who shape your ability to see what's right in front of you, using this narrative frame. Be careful of people like that. And like Taleb says, good storytellers do this a lot, and this is defamiliarization. They could use stereotypes. They could, and that's what Iago does. He primes these stereotypes. Like Michael Cassio is a ladies' man. He's the kind of guy who would sleep with Desdemona. That makes it more likely, that makes Othello fall for that a little more easily. He also throws stereotypes at people they don't fit, like making Desdemona seem like a slut. But it doesn't fit, but that stereotype is so threatening to Othello that it takes over. So if somebody like Iago is able to use stereotypes and use narrative frames to manipulate people, good storytelling does the opposite. It defamiliarizes. It takes these stereotypes and it tears them apart. Even if it's a good stereotype, like Othello is the noble, virtuous warrior with pietas or chivalry, somebody like Aeneas or El Cid, he still has a weakness. And of course the stereotype of the sort of the villain or the vice isn't always so obvious. The simple narratives, the simple scripts, the simple stereotypes are manipulations of reality that aren't accurate. And people can use those against us, but Shakespeare is defamiliarizing. He's disrupting our expectations. He's taking something that we thought we knew. He's challenging our illusion of knowledge by taking something we thought we knew and saying, look at it this way. What if this is happening beneath the surface? What if that person you thought was your friend is manipulating you in this way? Now that's not a nice thought. We would like a happy ending where you do the right thing like Othello and Desdemona did and everything works out in the end. And that's one of the good things about good literature is it doesn't always give us what we want. It doesn't always give us a happy ending. It doesn't always give us the easy concepts to follow, the easy stories to follow, the easy characters, the easy stereotypes. It doesn't confirm our frames. It doesn't confirm our preconceptions. But by challenging those preconceptions, those assumptions, it actually makes us think more. And when we leave the theater, or when we close the book, we go back out into the world, it doesn't have to make us more cynical. We don't have to worry that all of our friends are actually stabbing us in the back. We don't have to worry that no matter what we do, it's all going to fall in the end. I don't think that's what Shakespeare is getting at all. But we finish this exercise of this really complicated awareness of narrative frames within narrative frames within narrative frames, or minds conceiving of minds conceiving of minds. And once we go back out into the real world, hopefully the real world will be pretty simple. The real world may be complicated, but it's probably simpler than that. And we've had this practice, this skill, dealing with this really complicated process of mental manipulation. And hopefully that's going to make us much more capable of dealing with whatever reality can possibly throw at us.